All right, well, yeah, thanks so much for inviting me. I'm very excited to talk to this great group. I'm going to be talking about learning with others, the mechanisms and learning benefits of peer instruction, or in other words, I'm going to be making the case for peer instruction within your classes. So I approach this research with the idea of helping teachers build tools, strategies, and pedagogies that they can use within their classes. And we've discussed a lot of those over the course of this conference, from testing and retrieval practice, effective note-taking, movement and gestures within the classroom, productive failure, building connections. So a lot of great strategies and tools. I'm going to be just arguing that we should, without a doubt, be incorporating peer instruction practices as one of these teaching tools that we can utilize in a wide range of scenarios. So what exactly is peer instruction? In peer instruction, instructors pose a question to a student, students answer on their own, then they discuss with a peer, and following discussion, they answer again on their own. Now, this is not a new technique or pedagogy. I'm sure many of you use this within your classes already. It was specifically developed by Eric Mazur in Harvard for physics instruction, and is used very broadly in university physics classes, where more than a quarter of physics faculty report that peer instruction makes up a large portion of their instruction.
Oh.
In fact, it's been advocated to be one of the best practices to be used in science instruction. So we're going to look at a little deeper dive into this and see how effective it is. Prior research shows that it is really effective for students in a lot of ways, especially when we compare it to a lecture format. In fact, most of the research looking at the benefits of peer instruction compared to that traditional didactic full lecture format. And when we compare it to that, we see a whole bunch of student benefits from reducing student attrition or dropout in these classes, decreasing failure rates, improving student attendance, and bolstering student engagement. And maybe this shouldn't be surprising, right? If you switch from pure lecture to some more active materials and more active strategies, you should see greater engagement and less failure. We're going to look at, in particular, one very consistent result of peer instruction, and that's that discussion improves student performance. So accuracy following discussion is higher, greater than accuracy before that discussion. And we see that Simon et al. Found that on 70 out of 71 questions, performance improved from that pre-discussion answer to the post-discussion answer. And this has to result from students switching from an incorrect answer to a correct answer more often than vice versa. So about 60% of incorrect answers are switched to correct through the discussion, whereas only about 10% of correct answers get switched to incorrect during that discussion. We're going to look at several reasons or why that's happening. So I'm going to lay out 4 questions that hopefully we'll get to 5 with the online instruction. First one just being, why does it benefit student answers, and what happens during those discussions? We'll compare it to other sized groups and whether these benefits really persist and lead to long-term retention of the knowledge, before finally addressing, well, what does this mean for online instruction? So we'll start with the first question there, why does it benefit student answers? And one of the simple explanations is just that students are switching to the answer of the more confident peer. This is sort of a simple transmission idea. The one with that's more confident in their answer tells the less confident student what the answer should be, and then you switch to that, and that could lead to improvements in student performance, even though it's just simple transmission of the knowledge. And so this would mean that discussion would amplify the dominant or most confident answers without really generating any new knowledge. Perhaps a more interesting or hopeful explanation is that peer discussion helps students generate new knowledge, helps them co-construct it with their partner. And this could happen because students have to verbalize their explanations to create a common representation of the problem. And those processes can identify gaps in students' mental models and result in new knowledge being formed. If this is the case, we expect final answers to be drawn to the correct answer above and beyond just what could be predicted by confidence going into this discussion. So again, here's a brief layout of the procedure. We present students with a question related to course content. These are all multiple choice questions. They don't have to be, but we used all multiple choice questions, where we are asking students to apply or think about the concepts related to the questions. These typically are not just fact recall, but really trying to get students to engage with the material and apply it to settings. So we ask them to first answer on their own. We also ask them to rate their confidence in their answer to help us distinguish between the two competing hypotheses here. Then they pair up with a neighbor in the class and discuss their question and answer with a partner before answering the question again and answering or rating their confidence in their answer after discussion. We've gathered data across, for this particular question, across 6 different classes with over 200 students total. And these classes range from sort of a sophomore level cognitive psych class all the way up into a master's level, intro master's level course. And these are obviously going to vary in the size of the courses. So they can be as big as 61 students down to the smallest course we have with 12 students. And we're going to first examine whether accuracy changes across discussion as prior research has suggested. And so across the x-axis there, we have the 6 different classes. And we see from pre to post, students are answering more accurately following discussion compared to pre-discussion. And there's about a little less than a 10% benefit, which is a pretty significant benefit in accuracy there. And again, that has to be because more students are switching from incorrect answers to correct than from correct to incorrect. So we actually see very little of correct answers being shifted away. We can look more closely at what questions are benefiting from peer instruction. So on the x-axis here, we have pre-discussion accuracy. So that's the difficulty of those questions. On the right side are the ones that students are answering really well to begin with, very high proportion correct. And on the left, those are the very difficult questions that very few students are actually answering correctly. Now on the y-axis, we have the post-discussion accuracy, same idea. If discussion did not change accuracy across from pre to post, those blue dots would all lie along the red line. The blue dots represent individual questions. And what we see is that those blue dots on average are above that red line, meaning we are getting benefits to accuracy from discussion. Now, importantly, we see that these benefits extend not just on the really easy questions and not just on those really easy questions, but throughout all levels of difficulty there. So even the questions that are very difficult here that few students are getting correct, just having them even discuss those very difficult questions is yielding consistent benefits as other questions. Now this is in contrast with what Eric Mazur has often argued here, that you should only use this for a small specified range of difficulties from between 0.35% correct, proportion correct before discussion to about 0.7. We're arguing it doesn't have to be the narrow range. We're getting benefits outside of that narrow range as well. All right, so how does it relate to confidence? We see that when peers disagree, their final answers actually only align with the more confident peer 58% of the time, right? So 42% of the time, the more confident peer does not convince the other one, or the answers are not aligning with the more confident peer. 42% of the time. And what we're seeing is that if peers always chose the more confident answer during discussion, final accuracy would be 69%. That's significantly lower than our actual final accuracy, meaning that by ignoring or by disregarding the more confident answer, some of the times we're getting improvements in the accuracy. So by disregarding the more confident answer, students yield greater accuracy. So going into depth a little bit more about when do they keep their answer and when do they switch their answer, we're going to predict them keeping their answer from their own confidence going in, their partner's confidence going in, and whether they were correct or not going into discussion. And so I'll take you through these results one at a time. As students' own confidence increases, they're more likely to keep their answer. As their partner's confidence increases, they are less likely to keep their answer. But above and beyond the confidences that are going into this, if students are correct, they are more likely to keep their answer. So above and beyond the confidence, students are keeping their answer when they are correct. Again, this indicates that it's not just a process of weighting people's confidence, it's not just a process of figuring out of a simple transmission from the more confident peer to the less confident peer, but it's about testing out these answers and generating new knowledge to help decipher between them. Another way of representing that is displayed in this graph here, where on the right side we have where on the x-axis, it's the difference in initial confidence. So if you're a lot more confident than your partner, you're over here. If your partner is a lot more confident than you, you're over here. And we just look at the probability of keeping your answer. So when you're incorrect, even when you're more confident than your peer, you're going to keep the answer. If your peer is more confident than you, you're going to switch your answer. But when we look at going into this discussion, if you're correct, all those green dots are when you are correct going into it, and those consistently lay above the red boxes, meaning that above and beyond confidence again, whether you're correct or not dictates whether you keep your answer. All right, so we can also ask whether metacognitive accuracy is changing across discussion. Does discussion reveal something about the coherence of the answers, then shows up in students' judgments of their own knowledge? And to do that, we'll compute a gamma correlation between confidence and correctness, both before and after discussion. And across our six classes here, we have a pretty consistent improvement in metacognitive awareness, in resolution of one's own judgments about one's answers, that indicates that learners are understanding more about their own knowledge just through discussion. So from this first question, we can see that the correct answer is carrying weight above and beyond student confidence that's going into this instruction, that's going into the discussion. So these final answers are more accurate than we would predict if students always just chose the answer of the more confident peer, and discussion is improving learners' metacognitive monitoring of their own knowledge. So in answering why does it benefit student answers, we would argue that it's not just simple transmission of knowledge from one peer to the other, but there's hints of more construction and generation going on. To get more into that, we're going to dive deep into what happens during peer instruction discussion. And this study resulted from the impact of COVID on my own research. We were planning on going into some middle school, high schools, and looking at some stuff this semester, but that did not get to happen. So instead we shifted to doing some peer instruction recorded over Zoom from my master's level students that I had this semester. And then we recorded these discussions that happened, and then we analyzed the content of what happened during those discussions. So this is a qualitative study about what's happening during those discussions. Students are answering individually, then they discuss with their peer over Zoom, and then they answer again individually. We only have 4 pairs of intro-level MA students doing this because this is qualitative and in much more depth. And they answered 5 questions. They did this over the summer, but they were questions related to content from the semester. And then we analyzed those themes. And so before I get to the qualitative results, I do want to just talk a little bit about what this looks like. So even over Zoom, discussion is taking about 2 minutes per question, with a range of 41 seconds to about a little over 3 minutes. So even with these questions with master's level students, it's not taking a whole lot of time. We see that there's about 7 switches of speakers back and forth per question. So there's a lot of interchange going on. There's a lot of back and forth. This ranged from 4 to 8 switches. And even with this really small sample, even with only 5 questions and 8 total students, we do see a significant benefit across discussion in our accuracy. So what are the themes that come about when we analyze what's happening during those discussions? And I'm going to go through these quickly, and then we'll go into more in depth. So students first, almost always, report their answers to their partner and the confidence in their answers. Then they will verbalize or justify their own answers, often by retrieving relevant prior knowledge or connecting it to personal experiences. Then there's often a process of creating a common representation between the 2 peers. And in this process, peers can identify gaps in their knowledge. So just going through this, this should not be a surprise, right? This is pretty obvious that students are going to report what they picked and how confident they are. But I would argue that this is actually a really crucial and key piece of this peer instruction process. By having students pick an answer before they head into discussion, there's some aspect of personal responsibility that is put on them to go into the discussion having an answer, to go into the discussion having an explanation and having thought this out already. So an example is, so I'm not confident in my answer, but I put B. So that's an example of a very common thing that happens. Next, students will verbalize or justify their own answer. Like this, yeah, I put A just because I feel like Piaget was more into assimilation and accommodation, how those challenges to persons' beliefs influence learning. So beyond just saying what they picked, they also verbalize their explanation and also justify it. And even that explanation in and of itself can be beneficial. So here we have a very short little explanation of what happened. Why did you think C make sense? Why did you pick C? And 2 says, it was between C and D for me. I do think it's true that they may be used more by experts than novices because I feel that experts may set a more measurable goal. But I went with C because I guess it is not specific and you can't measure. Maybe it goes too far into the future and it's not useful. I feel like the useful piece is what made me choose C. Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, okay. But then 2 immediately comes back and through that self-explanation has recognized that no, it might actually be D. And just through explaining why they picked C to their partner, they almost chose D and made them reevaluate choosing D, which was the correct answer. So they almost switched just through their own explanation, convincing them to move to a better answer. In these verbalizations and justifications, they also retrieve relevant prior knowledge. So on the question about self-efficacy, yeah, if I remember it correct, perceived self-efficacy is threefold and listing 3 things that influence self-efficacy. And so students are retrieving relevant prior knowledge from the class and applying it and using it to justify their explanations. This picture is what I assume weather is like in Canada right now, and I am very jealous given that I can barely leave my house at this point in Arizona. All right, anyway, so retrieving this prior knowledge is actually probably really beneficial. As we've heard repeatedly now, there are a lot of benefits of retrieval. And creating an explanation or a justification where you have to retrieve prior knowledge is going to benefit that future retrieval of that knowledge as well. We also see another way that students are verbalizing or justifying their answer is by connecting it to their own experiences. So a student said, part of it's my background too. I believe in hands-on application education. One phrase we say is success breeds success. So when a student succeeds, that makes them want to try harder to succeed. So there, we never brought up the phrase success breeds success. They are bringing that in on their own. That is a phrase that they use in their own philosophy. And that type of explanation is also really a deep level of processing that's related to things like self-reference, where you tie things into your own existing schema, which is really useful and helpful. All right, part of this process then goes on to a situation where students have to agree on a common representation of the problem and potentially the answer. So in a conversation, in a peer discussion where they're discussing how Piaget and Vygotsky relate to language, a student says, yeah, maybe I shouldn't change the definition of language because I tried to understand language as interaction, like the conversation. Maybe I shouldn't change the meaning of language. So through this interaction with a partner, they are modifying how they represent that problem, how they view the problem. And that's a lot of deep processing. That's a lot of stepping back and taking perspective, and that can involve a lot of deep processing. Others argue that that'll strip away some of the surface features of the problem, particularly in physics. It'll strip away some of the surface features and leave you with the deep structure. And finally, the last process I would argue is that help students identify and rectify gaps in their understanding or detect and correct those errors. So an example here is I immediately eliminated A. I might have done that too fast because I read it really quickly and I was like, oh, not that one, because I immediately associated with Vygotsky only because of cultural tools. So again, interacting and creating a common representation has caused the student to take a step back and sort of detect and correct some of the errors that they had in their logic. So each of these steps is actually a really helpful step, from having students report or students naturally reporting their answers, making them personally responsible, to explaining it and justifying it and creating some friction to create a common representation, and ultimately identify gaps in those knowledge. All right, so we argue that it's more than simple transmission, that there's construction instead, and our qualitative analysis argues or finds more evidence for that constructive generative processes that are happening, and that there's complex interactions with many cognitive benefits, from retrieval practice to creating connections, metacognitive help in identifying gaps in your knowledge, and so forth. So we're going to go back to my primary area of expertise, quantitative studies, and look at how do these benefits of peer instruction compare to other group work, other sized discussion, and how long do the benefits persist. So with these questions, we're going to experimentally vary the size of groups that students are working in from, we've got peers, we've got small groups, and we've got class-wide discussion. And then we're going to measure long-term retention by not just pre and post discussion, but also how well do they retain that information at the end of the semester. All right, so in this next experiment, we're going to test the difference between peer instruction and class-wide discussion. And we'll randomly / alternatively assign questions to a peer instruction versus class discussion. And so in the class discussion, students answer each question individually, but then we take a poll across the whole class of the answers. So we did this just with hands. Other people argue or do this with eye clickers or Zoom polls or whatnot. But this is a pretty standard in terms of class discussion, taking a poll of student answers. Then, as an instructor, I stepped back and allowed any student to provide justification for or against any answer. That's a big difference from peer instruction. Students answer the question individually, and then the instructor, me, would provide the accepted answer, the correct answer, to the question. Now, they do this about once per class, either a peer instruction or a class discussion question throughout the semester. And then at the end of the semester, right before the finals are due, students retake a test or take a test of all of these questions again. So we just assess how well do they remember the answers to these questions? How much have they retained at the end of the semester of these exact questions again? So again, it's a little bit like peer instruction. We have a pre and a post, but we have different things happening during the discussion than happen in peer instruction. Now, notably for this class discussion, these classes are very small. These classes are 10 to 15 students, and they are intro level master's students. So it's maybe less intimidating to participate in this type of setting than it is in a bigger lecture hall, in a bigger class, or in an undergraduate class. But this is the sample that we have, 3 classes of these students. And what we see in our proportion correct from pre to post, we do see benefits of peer instruction from pre to post, right? About a 10% benefit in student performance. We also see a benefit in class discussion from pre to post. And noticeably, the benefits of class discussion on that immediate post test are significantly greater than those of peer instruction, right? So following class-wide discussion, immediately following class-wide discussion, students are more accurate in answering those questions. And this could be because there's greater transmission of knowledge across the class, right? When you have peers partnered up, the knowledge is kind of siloed into those little partner groups and cannot be transmitted all the way across the class. An alternative explanation of this is just that there's a lot fewer students that are willing to contribute and speak, and so those students may just be the ones that are oftentimes more correct. In any case, there's different explanations for this. We'll get to it in a minute. But why that's happening is that students that are initially incorrect, more students are switching away from their answer in the class-wide discussion than in the partner discussion, and fewer of those students that are initially correct are switching away in class compared to peer. So you're getting greater switch to the correct answer and getting fewer switches away from the correct answer. Well, what about the long-term retention then, right? So what does it look like on that final test? Are these equally beneficial for long-term retention? What we find is that, in fact, no, they are not, right? So there are actually, despite the immediate benefit to student accuracy in class discussion, on that final long-term retention, we see a crossover interaction where now peer instruction is outperforming class discussion. We see that students in the class discussion actually show forgetting between their post-discussion and the final test, whereas students in the peer instruction actually learn more or perform better compared on the final test compared to their post-discussion. All right, this is very complex. This is very busy. At the top we have peer instruction. At the bottom we have class discussion. I'm just going to point out a couple of things. This is let me bring my laser pointer up. This is students that were initially correct and stayed correct following their discussion. On the final test in peer instruction, they kept the final answer, 63% of those students. Whereas in class discussion, if they were correct and stayed correct, only 56% of those students kept the final answer. So peer instruction is leading to better retention of correct answers than class discussion. In contrast, when we look at those that are initially incorrect and stay incorrect after discussion in peer instruction, only 24% keep that bad incorrect answer. Whereas down in the class discussion, 36% of students that were incorrect and stayed incorrect are incorrect on that final test. So again, we have a greater fixing of incorrect answers following peer instruction than we do following class-wide discussion. All right, so then we're going to look, well, maybe class-wide discussion is too big of a group. Maybe there's too much loafing or cognitive loafing that we'll come back to. What if we had smaller group work instead? So we alternatively assign questions to peer instruction or small group work. And this is going to happen very similar to peer instruction, but instead of working with a single partner, they're going to work in a group of 4 to 6 students. So maybe this will allow a little bit of a greater transmission of knowledge across students. But in other ways, it's very similar to our peer instruction, just with small groups. We only have one class here. We only have an upper level undergrad class that has 40 students that participated in this. So both groups are actually benefiting following discussion. Their accuracy is greater following discussion than before discussion, and noticeably does not differ between the two groups. When we then look at what that means on the final test, whether they persist the same amount, we see that they do not. In fact, peer instruction leads to about a 10 percentage point boost over small group discussion. Again, I'm going to argue because students that are correct throughout peer instruction are more likely to retain the knowledge than during group discussion. Whereas those that are incorrect throughout group discussion are not very likely to fix those answers. We can see that down here, they keep those answers on the final test most of the time. Whereas in peer instruction, they actually switch over to the correct answer a lot more of the time. All right, so size matters, right? Peer instruction benefits long-term retention over small groups or over large groups. I'm going to argue that this is because students feel a greater personal responsibility when they're interacting with just a single other peer. And there's a greater potential for cognitive loafing or less processing when you have larger groups to sit back and let other people do the lion's share of that cognitive processing. All right, so going through, I'd argue that the best retention is happening with our peer discussion in these small partner scenarios rather than small groups or large groups. Now, even beyond this, we can look and see, well, does this create transferable knowledge? The knowledge, my research has only looked at retention of those exact questions over the long term. Other knowledge by Smith et al. Looked at whether this knowledge transfers to similar questions. And so what they did is they had a pre and post peer discussion. And then after they answered that post discussion without any further instructions, students had to answer a related question, a very similar related question on their own. And so we see from pre to post, student performance increases. And so that all argues that from post to that related question, we don't see a drop-off, meaning that students have created transferable knowledge within that discussion that they can use on related questions later. Further, we can look at how this compares to other strategies. One other strategy that's related here is self-explanation. So what happens in self-explanation is students pick an answer and then they just have to explain to themselves why they picked that answer. They have to verbalize it to themselves, but they are not paired up with a partner. This is in a physiological class, a physiology class. We see for peer instruction, there's a benefit from pre to post. And even in self-explanation, which is useful, there's a benefit from pre to post, but that benefit is larger in peer instruction than it is in the self-explanation condition. So the benefits that you get are greater when you have to interact with another person than when you're just explaining it to yourself. And this maps onto the ICAP hierarchy that Mickey Chi has promoted, which argues that there's a hierarchy to the qualities or benefits that different types of activities provide, where the best or most beneficial activity is the interactive activity, where students are working with others to construct new knowledge. They're not constructing it on their own, but they are interacting with others to co-generate, to co-construct. Mickey argues that is greater or more beneficial than constructing it on your own, than building it or generating it on your own. And that constructive process is better than manipulating or being active during learning without generating. But being active is better than passively receiving knowledge. All right. So you might be saying, oh yeah, this is really similar to other techniques that I use. Potentially clicker questions. Well, I would argue clicker questions can be used in an interactive way. They can be used where students are forced or tasked with interacting with partners, but they don't have to be. So I think that interactive piece is key. Another similar technique that many of you might use is think, pair, share, where students might be given a question to think about, work in a pair, and then share it to the broader group. This could be very similar. Notably, peer instruction relies on content that you've already covered in class, and so it requires students to think back and retrieve relevant, related information that they know. Whereas think, pair, share could be used to talk about opinions, could be used to be talking about personal experiences and so forth. In small group work, if it's structured in the same way, can result in very similar things as we talked about. All right, so some broader benefits of peer instruction. We've talked about consistent cognitive benefits. I'd argue that this is a really simple and straightforward and versatile technique to use. It breaks up the pace so that you're not lecturing for long periods of time. If you want to break it up with these questions, it's really useful. It's a way of formatively assessing student understanding. And there are effective and motivational benefits to peer instruction over that lecture. All right, so how does it relate to online learning, as we want online learning to be successful for our students and maybe persist longer? Education might be moving more in the direction of online learning, so we want it to be successful. And there's a history of educational innovations that have turned out to not be useful or not be revolutionary in the long course of history, from correspondence courses through the mail, radio distance learning and television distance learning. And one of the downfalls of these types of innovations has been that they lack social interactions, that students are off on their own, and the limited social interactions, maybe between the instructor and the student in a correspondence course, happens over a week, right? There's a long delay between those. So I'm going to argue that if we don't want online education to be as ineffective or non-useful as these other historic educational innovations, we do need to consider social interactions. Humans are a social creature. And as of right now, online education is not structured in this manner. Online education has been structured to be scalable, to reach as many students with as little as effort as possible. And that has resulted in the content of online education to largely be pre-recorded videos and pre-recorded assessments where students take multiple choice quizzes on their own and get immediate feedback. This lack of social interactions in these scalable online courses has led to significant reductions in student satisfaction with the courses. And one of the very consistent findings about online education is that students drop out at rates of 10 to 20% more than very similar in-person classes, because one of the reasons, again, is the lack of social interactions in community. And we know that social interactions in these online classes specifically have a wide range of benefits, from supporting student self-efficacy, enhancing self-regulation, boosting motivation, increasing satisfaction, increasing student retention. All of these things happen when students interact with peers and interact more with their instructor. Whereas the converse, the lack of social bonding, reduces a sense of accountability, reduces belongingness, all of these things that are really hurtful or harmful for the learner. All right, so how do we do this in online environments? Well, I'd argue that synchronous classes where students are all together with their instructors, doing this is actually relatively easy, right? There's Zoom breakout groups. There's Zoom polling that you could all do this within Zoom. If you're using Zoom, you could use it in Zoom with conjunction with iClickers or with Top Hat or with Kahoot. But you can do this if students are all at the same place at the same time, and it's important to do. You can also do this through small group work that's structured appropriately. I'm not going into small group work specifically here. But asynchronous classes where students are not all at the same point, same place at the same time, where they're not all on Zoom at the same time, is actually pretty difficult. A lot of people use or try to use discussion boards to do this, but I would argue that maybe you need to be a little bit wary about this potential, posing a question, and even just requiring students to respond to someone else. I don't think is a particularly good way of fostering that back and forth interaction that's really useful, that authentic interaction that's helpful. When you get students that are just replying very similarly in a large class in a discussion board. There's alternatives to this that might be more authentic, like VoiceThread or Flipgrid, where students record themselves, video record themselves with their phone or laptop, answering a question, and it becomes more authentic them speaking off the cuff, more than being able to respond easily through video to other peers in the class, and so forth. Other potential ways are creating pairs of students that have to work on an online concept map or mental map together, or some assignments together. Hopefully that would instill more of the friction, the more of the back and forth. That's helpful. And potentially some online group work could be possible, even with asynchronous classes. And I would suggest potentially forming groups based upon students' time availability. One aspect that they love about asynchronous classes, they don't have to be somewhere at a specific time, especially for students in different time zones. So if you could form groups based on time availability, when they're available to complete that, that could be a better way of doing this. So again, I'm just going to argue that this is a really important piece to intentionally create social cognitive interactions between students. And I argue that this is really worth including peer instruction in your toolkit. It can be warm-up exercises as students are entering the Zoom meeting. It can be presented on as they come in. It can be a bell work or a bell work, similar idea. An exit ticket as students are just about to leave. They have to work on this question, work on it with a peer, and so forth. Or it can be within the middle of your course to break up that course content and emphasize key ideas. All right, that's what I've got. So thanks so much. I've enjoyed this conference a lot.
Thanks so much, Jonathan. First, I just want to comment on, I thought it was a really nimble research pivot for you to collect the qualitative data and on peer instruction. And I think, especially cognitive psychologists, I don't think we do that enough. What do people actually do when they're left to their own devices? So I was really interested to see that data, and I'm wondering from that, did that emerge an idea that should we explicitly train students on peer instruction on here's what you should be doing?
Yeah, that's certainly a possibility. So these are the ones I did with the online qualitative research were master's level students. So they're obviously motivated and wanting to participate here. And so they may act very differently than, say, high school students. So just naturally, those students in this group were doing a lot of good things. Now, they were doing some really weak things, like, oh, I just remember that I think it was C, right? When it's not just a memory-based question. That was their justification. And so there's sometimes when they are doing that, it's relatively rare, but I think we could be training them in a little bit of argumentation, a little bit of how are you justifying your answer? And that could be an interesting avenue to explore whether that training would actually be beneficial and potentially more beneficial for high schoolers or undergrad students. Yeah.
It's interesting because I remember Mark McDaniel gave a talk when he was comparing, I think it was in a chemistry class, his study in chemistry students on whether they are generalizers or memorizing specific exemplars. And I asked him, can you train students to not just memorize exemplars and look at the actual general approach? And he said he has not been able to do that.
Yeah, those are interesting differences, right? The students are bringing a lot with them, right? Especially when they get into college level, about prior histories, prior experiences, what they believe is expected of them, and so forth. So yeah, I think it takes a lot to shift people, and I think it would take quite a bit to shift how people are arguing for or against answers within peer discussion section, because I think they probably come in with certain styles and techniques, and I know my sample of 8 students is very small, but there were noticeable differences among those students, right? One student would very often go to personal experiences, whereas others would not. So there seem to be pretty big, I do notice some pretty big differences within that small sample.
So you mentioned high school students. So we actually have a high school grade 9 and 10 math teacher who comments. So you got to work with master's level grad students who are highly motivated. She wonders how to pair peers in unmotivated teenagers. Often even high achievers are not good or comfortable with peer instruction, and peers put up a self-esteem wall rather than willing to learn from their peers. Or the two might just use time to socialize rather than spend the time on the allotted tasks. So any tips on how to make strategies useful with students who are unmotivated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually, research suggests that these social interactions are motivational in and of themselves. So I certainly commiserate with that. I was a high school physics and chemistry teacher for a couple of years, and that is a huge problem. Students not being motivated, students being off task, using the time to socialize. And that's part of how to do that, I think, is to make them responsible for that by, taking into account, measuring their answer beforehand and after, and giving them a lot of practice doing that. So if you collect answers both before and after, it gives them a little bit of motivation. I'm not going to say it's the best or the answer to every motivational problem, but collecting that answer after discussion does provide them a little bit more motivation to work on the question, right? To come to an answer. And the other part of that is I do peer instruction or some aspect of this pretty much once a class period in my college level classes. And that practice of doing this makes them more comfortable. They might not be comfortable with this at the beginning, but they get comfortable with this. They get comfortable with it quick because we do it pretty frequently. The other aspect of keeping kids on task is just your physical presence, right? So when we're physically present, I can walk around the class and try to, even undergrads aren't always on task, so try to point them back to the question at hand, and if they're finished, that's fine, and so forth, yeah.
I've heard that happens with undergrads sometimes. I have a comment and a question from William that connects here. So first, William says that he uses testimonials from the last semester on just how useful peer instruction was. So that might be useful to help convince students. And in my own teaching, for most of the pedagogical innovations I do, I explain to students why we're doing it. And I show them the data of why we're doing this. And that seems to help get some buy-in, or at least willingness to accept. So William asked a question. So you looked at the size of the groups. How about the familiarity? So Does peer instruction work better with pairs that have worked together for the entire semester as opposed to working with different peers over the semester? Because maybe it takes time to get to know people.
Right, yeah, that's a great question. And that was actually going to be a future direction of my research, is to have students naturally will work with that same student across the semester, right? That is something that happens almost always. They find a partner and they're always working with that partner. And so I was going to, in future research, switch that up a little bit. So have you worked with this partner before, or are you new, and how many times have you worked with the partner, and look at that influence on it. We don't have any data on that actually. What we do have data on is that going into peer instruction, even before they have discussed, the partners that are pairing up are more likely to have the same answer than two randomly selected peers from the class, which is indicating potentially that the good students potentially are sitting together and working with other good students, and the poor students might be sitting in a different area of the classroom and working with other poor students who are not agreeing on the right answer. And so that is an interesting question for that reason. The knowledge is not distributed equally across the classroom even before discussion happens. And so switching up who you're working with would be a way of spreading out that knowledge and expertise a little bit better than allowing it to just happen naturally. But there are benefits. If you don't want to go to that work, to that hassle, there are benefits of just letting them work with a neighbor and a peer.
Yeah, so if you're teaching in a Zoom environment, you could always randomly assign people to breakout rooms or keep the breakout rooms consistent across the term.
Yeah.
Might be an interesting study, like just to do like a crossover. As you know, I think one of the most elusive things to look at from a cognitive psychology perspective is to demonstrate transfer of learning, especially far transfer of learning. Okay, you understand this example, seems you understand this concept. I'm going to give it to you later in a completely novel context. Can you demonstrate mastery? So Michelle Rivers asked, have there been effects of peer instruction on transfer of learning?
Yeah, so the major study that's been done and that was published in Science with regards to this is the Smith et al. In 2009, who did a pre-post and then immediately gave a related question. And they don't have a comparison group that hasn't done peer instruction, but they argue that performance on that related question does not drop. It stays about the same level as post-instruction, as post-discussion. And so they argue that this is showing transferable knowledge, that students are generating knowledge that they can transfer to new analogous questions pretty soon after their discussion. So I think there's more research that needs to be done, whether this is truly creating transferable knowledge. I will argue that when I look at those transcripts of what students are talking about during the peer discussion, they talk about a lot of different things. They talk about not just the answers that they've chosen, they also talk about the other options that are listed on our multiple choice questions. They almost always talk about every single option for our master's level students and why those are correct or incorrect. And so I think there would be transferable knowledge to at least among the 4 different options that we measure there, the 4 alternative choices, that they could do better on a question related to one of those, for sure.
So for peer instruction, it has the 2 stages. What is the importance of that first stage? Why can't you just jump to that second stage?
Yeah, I think there's at least in the advice-taking literature, there's big differences of creating your own answer, staking out a point of view before you head into a discussion. And I would argue, I think that that's a key piece here, is that they have to try to work through it on their own, and they have to come to those peer discussions with having some thoughts, with having some perspective. Otherwise, I think you would find more students going into those discussions not having really thought about it, not really having picked out an answer, and just sort of more relying on potentially the other person, the more knowledgeable person that's in their group. And so I think it would reduce the amount of deep processing that we're getting when we see that you record their answers before they go into that discussion.
So I don't know if you had the chance to see the data blitz talk by Bill Ju right before, but he has tests with multiple choice questions where there's a metacognitive tail. So students have to not only answer the question, but then they also have to consider which of these did you think were the distractors and why was it a distractor? So I'm envisioning here a stage one where students have to do that leading to peer instruction. Do you think that would enrich the effect of peer instruction more?
Yeah, that's interesting. So we do ask students to rate their confidence in their answers. So that's a very small aspect of what Bill was talking about there. So we do require, just for our experimental procedures, students to provide their confidence in their answer. And it's interesting because I don't know if that is prompting students in those peer instruction discussions, but they almost always discuss about how confident they are in their answer. Almost always. Like, I'm very confident in this. Some even say, oh, I put a 5 on this one because I wasn't too confident. So we are asking for a tiny bit of that. And they will naturally then, during discussion, talk about why they think the other ones are distractors. So I think there's a lot of similar things that are overlapping here with what Bill is talking about. That they do go through and discuss, oh, this one's probably a distractor for this reason. Or no, I'm not too confident in this, but I think I remember this being something that we talked about. But it would be interesting to combine them and see if there's additional benefits there.
Okay. And there's another question from our audience here. Did your research look at any peer review activities versus peer instruction? I'm not familiar with peer review activities as a term, but maybe you are.
So I would assume this is, I think this is talking about if a student writes a paper or a grant or a research proposal, and you give it to a peer to review it and provide feedback. And I don't know that research very well, to be honest. I do use that. I think it is a good way to help students in my upper level grad classes. I do use that technique because it does help students bond and interact with their classmates, but it also helps them explain why they're thinking the way they're thinking. But yeah, I don't know of the research on that very well, and I don't know how that compares to peer instruction.
Okay. And just another thing that occurred to me. So one of the interesting models that Faria-san and I are looking at in our education cognition lab is pre-testing. So pre-testing is this kind of interesting effect where you ask people questions before they even learn, and they mainly get them wrong.
Right.
Right. But it still seems to benefit them going through this potentially frustrating experience. So I'm wondering, what would it be like going through pre-testing in a peer instruction type paradigm? Do you think that might do more harm than good? And this is completely a speculative question.
Oh, that's interesting. So what I think is fascinating, but one of the reasons why peer instruction is so beneficial, especially in the long term, is that even if you're incorrect going into discussion and you stay incorrect coming out of discussion, students fix their answer through that instructor. When the instructor goes through and says, this is actually the correct answer, and they fix it better than they do when there's a class discussion or when there's small group work. So I think there's probably potential there that even with pre-questions, students in peer instruction would adeptly fix those holes in their knowledge pretty well.
Okay. Thanks so much, Jonathan. That was a great talk. Stimulated a lot of ideas for me, and just thinking about where to go next as we are all trying to improve online education.